next. And I'm going to call this thing account. It's asking me what should it be a subclass of. NSObject is fine. Most everything descends from NSObject, so that's fine for my purposes. I'm going to go ahead and click next. Going to go ahead and click create, and voila! At the top left of my file, I now have the ability to represent an account object. So let's see what I've gotten for free. In account.h, I have interface account descends from NSObject, and in account.m, I just have a blank implementation. So now I have an opportunity, again, for the first time to implement some notion of an account balance. And I'm going to propose the following. In my .h file, I'm going to propose a property that's going to have, let's say, a sign. We'll come back to that in a moment. Non-atomic attributes. I'm going to propose that this be an unsigned long balance. So a couple of details pop out here. So one, unsigned, just to be clear, means that the value can only be non-negative. So it can include 0. So that's what unsigned would mean. All right, so long, what's that? What's the role there? We want it to be 64-bit. So on this platform, doing a long gives me a 64-bit number, and that just means it's pretty darn big. I want to avoid what's generally called integer overflow, whereby if we type in too big of a number, I don't want it to roll over with as high probability to some random number. It turns out this is not an adequate defense. We can still break this ATM and deposit an arbitrary amount of money in our account pretty easily, but we'll simulate that in a bit. Non-atomic, this just has to do with multi-threading. I'm writing very simple code here. There's not going to be two threads trying to touch the account at once, though there could be certainly in a world with multiple ATMs on a network, but we'll keep it simple. And assign now is different. Typically, we've seen what attribute in lines like this? Yeah. So okay, we've seen copy, but more commonly thus far in our examples, we've seen strong or weak in this case. So assign literally just does just that. It gives me a setter that literally moves a value from the right-hand side of an expression to the left-hand side. There's no checking for duplicate values. There's no deep copying of objects. And this is perfectly fine for what's generally called a primitive, like a long. A long is just 64 bits. To copy 64 bits, you just assign it from the right to the left with an equal sign in between. So there's no need for strong or weak, which have to do with objects and pointers. A copy also has to do with objects and pointers. Assign is just for primitive. So that's all I've specified here. Okay, and by default, is this read-write or read-only? It's read-write, which means I get a setter and a getter automatically by having declared this property here. OK, so we're going to keep the account simple. We're not going to bother with account numbers or names or any of that. We're just going to keep it simple with our placeholder there. And now in my implementation of this object, I might want to do one thing. So it turns out an NSObject, recall, comes with some default functionality in the form of an init method. And that init method is defined in the NSObject class. And typically that method does nothing by default. But it's an opportunity for us to do something. What might you want to do in the way of initialization when you instantiate an account object for the first time?
Set an initial balance.
Yeah, so why don't we set an initial balance? So the signature for an init method, if you look at the documentations for NSObject, or just in general, the convention in iOS is, or in Objective-C, is to have an instance method, hence the hyphen, returns an ID, which is a pointer or nil, and it's called init by convention. So it's kind of like it's the initialization half of a constructor. Alloc would be the other half. Again, a common paradigm is to say now this: if self gets super init, so this is just a common way of saying, one, call the parent class's implementation of init. Make sure that it doesn't return nil, because if it does return nil, I don't want to start doing work unnecessarily, lest I create problems. And now, if all is well, I'm going to do self.balance gets 0, and then I need to return myself. So that's it. If I deleted all of this, we wouldn't be initializing the primitive to a known value. So this way, we have a default value, or we could be nice, right? If the first time you sign up for a bank account, you get some free gift, maybe you get $100 in your account, and we could do that right here. Yes?
Why do you have to do super alloc and an int?
Super alloc and in. Because that would be bad, because when init is called, alloc has already been called. So the convention is call alloc, then init. So if init called alloc, that would be trying to instantiate the object twice. Good question. All right, so that's it. This is a super, super simple model, if you will, but it's representative of how we could go about encapsulating information, and maybe in a fancier world, this information would come from a database, and if it did, it could go in this model code. But we're going to use it just as an abstraction for what an actual account balance is. So now, what more do we have to do? Well, let me jump back to the pre-baked version that looks now like this. Notice that at top left, I have the exact same code that I wrote in advance. So I have a property called balance, and I have an implementation of init. So if we go back to the nib, I also did a few things in advance, consistent with what we said was necessary. One, I wired all of the buttons to my code using IB actions, and I wired my code to two different UI labels via IB outlets. So two directions. Now how can I check what directions they went in? Well, let me go ahead and choose the number 7, and notice that if I hold Control and click on there, there's a whole bunch in this drop-down, but the interesting one, recall from last week, is touch up inside. That's this act. And the result of that is to do what? Files owner digit. What could that mean? Call a method called digit on what object? On the files owner, which in this case is going to be view controller. Exactly. So I'm in the view controller class is nib, and the files owner is going to be the .m file. So let's take a look at the .m file. And indeed, there is, nested among a few other methods, a method called digit. So I've declared this as an instance method. It returns an IB action by convention, which is just synonymous with, remember your lower level C details? It's just void, just returns void, which means it returns nothing. And it takes a pointer called sender. And what is that going to be a pointer to? The button that was pressed. So this is my way of programmatically knowing what button was actually pressed. So here's a bit of a trick that we've leveraged with the UI view class. Notice in this first line of code, I'm doing the following. On the left-hand side, I instantiate what? Good, pointer to a UI button. And I keep asking this question so that the answer is not allocate a UI button, which is not the case. I've allocated a pointer to a UI button. On the right-hand side, what have I done? Casting. Exactly. So this is a C-style cast whereby sender's type, I don't really know. Because I declared it as an argument of a type ID, I don't actually really know what its type is. So therefore, I don't necessarily know what methods I can call on it, and therefore Xcode doesn't know whether or not to yell at me if I try calling a method maybe that doesn't exist. It's okay to send messages to objects even if they don't respond to them, but if I want to really leverage my compiler and my IDE here, it's nice if it can yell at me when I'm doing stupid things. So I can explicitly say that sender is of type UI button so that now anything I do with B will be known by Xcode as referring to a button. Yeah? Good question. That would be perfectly fine. You could do this. Let me scroll over. Your code just starts to look a little less readable, but that's perfectly fine. And there's another way we could do this. We don't strictly have to say ID up here. We could do this and then eliminate this line altogether and just refer to sender. And the only reason I left it this way is really just by convention. Typically, Apple always says ID as the type of the argument and then casts it explicitly. But functionally, it's the same. The compiler won't yell at you. OK, so here now is a little grade school arithmetic that's finally coming back to be useful. Why does this line work? Well, self.amount is referring to what? I actually don't know what amount is. So what is self in this context? What class are we inside of? So this is the view controller. See, I got out of sync here with my order of operations. Let me go to the .h file, and it looks like there's a few things in here. So let's actually pause for a moment and look at what's inside of this particular view controller. So I have a property that's called account, and it points to an account object. OK, so there's my bank account. There is my controller linking to my M in MVC model. So we saw that arrow promised in the picture earlier. What's next? A long amount. I'm not sure why there's an amount there, so we'll come back to that. There seems to be some duplication here for some reason, but we'll come back to that. And then here's the IB outlet and the IB action that I mentioned earlier. I apparently called it balance label for the balance at the bottom and deposit label for the current number I'm typing in at the top, just like a calculator. And then I have some instance methods that are declared down here. As a spoiler, we're looking at digit, and this is the method that's going to get invoked anytime I touch a digit, a number. Deposit is when I hit the green deposit button. Clear is when I hit the red clear button. And show is just a helper method I wrote to keep my code organized and centralize all of the view code, as we'll see in a moment. So account, to be clear, is an account, a pointer to an account object. So now we go back to the .m file. And now in digit, what am I doing? I'm storing self.amount, which was another unsigned long